Since I'm making this video on St. Patrick's Day, it seems quite reasonable to use a green theme as I did last year. So this year I've decided I'm going to make a pendant. I'm going to make a Kryptonite pendant using a chunk of decorative plastic. You get these plastic crystals. I'm not sure how readily available they are. I can't give a particular source for these. You might get them, I suppose eBay is probably a good source. I got these out of Home's decoration shop a while ago, and they're ideal for this application. And I'm going to basically, well, I've already drilled a hole in one of them after choosing one of the nicest looking ones with the least bubbles. And I'm going to put an LED in, but this isn't just a standard LED. This is a flickering LED. It's the type you get in the flickering candle LEDs things. And if you go on eBay and you search for 100 pieces flickering LED, that's 100 PCS, pieces, because that's what the Chinese always do, you'll find people selling bags of these LEDs in just about any colour: white, blue, orange, green, whatever. And in this case I've got a green one here, which, well, let me just stuff it down the battery contacts here and demonstrate it is indeed a flickering LED. You can see it shimmering up and down. You don't have to use a flickering one. I thought that would be quite nice to use in this. So here's the plan. It's going to be a pendant with a little battery pack up at the top, very small, and then it's going to drape round the neck on some thin wires and come down to the crystal. Here's the crystal, and it's just going to glow gently. Now, to make it versatile, I'm going to probably use a 2032 battery, a lithium cell, as the power source, but you could use, if you're going to use it just once or twice every so often, this is ideal. If you're going to use it on a daily basis, which I can't really think of many people who would do that, but if you did want to do it, you could make a tiny little rechargeable pack. However, in this instance, I'm going to use one lithium cell, and I'm going to use a resistor series just at a random location on the cable, the sort of pendant cable. And in this instance, I've chosen 100 ohm. 100 ohm it's just a random value I chose, and then it's going to be going through the LED. That resistor will achieve multiple effects. It means if you're using an ordinary LED, a non-flickering one, you can adjust the intensity of it. Well, even the flickering one, you can adjust the intensity by changing the value of the resistor, and that will make the battery last a bit longer as well. But it also means in the case of using the flickering LED, if you get the polarity on the battery connection wrong, the resistor will limit the current flowing through the LED, because sometimes these LEDs act like a sort of diode in reverse and just shunt out the supply, and that can damage the actual LED itself, can blow the little leads inside it or damage the chip. So by putting that resistor in series, it limits that current and lets the chip survive the LED. So right, let's work this out. I've already found a piece of wire, and this is some very thin cable. It's one of the thinner sort of interconnect wires. This one is it's 10 times 0.1 millimeter strands in this, so it's a very thin flexible cable. If you use standard sort of flexible cable, it might be too springy, and if that's the case, then the weight of the plastic on then might not be enough to actually keep it straight. It will just keep coiling up. This stuff is relatively flexible. Relatively, not absolutely perfect, but it's good enough. So let's get this out of the way at the moment and start soldering things together. So I'm going to strip the ends of this using my favourite strippers here. For those of you saying, why don't you use automatic strippers? The automatic strippers are pretty good for bigger cables, but for small cables like this, they can actually just end up breaking the strands quite a lot. So another thing I'm going to do here, when I embed the LED into the resin, I'm also going to pull a little bit of the resin up on top of the LED because, well, let's bring the notepad back in for this. When you've got the LED with the leads coming out, they're at their most fragile at the point they enter that, because any slight flexing, because the LED itself is quite rigid resin, they'll stress, and quite often the LED leads will break off at the point where they enter the resin if you flex the leads much. So what I'm thinking of doing here is, if this is a crystal surrounding the LED, I'm going to pot this in resin, but I'm also going to just pull it up over the top here just a little bit, just because the two-part resin has a slight flexibility to it, And also the lead covers, the insulation will be coming over these leads, which will give it extra support, and it will just take the strain off those. It means there's less chance of the wires actually breaking off the top of the crystal. So I have already drilled this crystal. I chose one, and I got a soldering iron, and I just basically, using the back of the soldering iron here, I just put a tiny little dent in it to act as a sort of centering hole. And then I drilled it out. I've drilled it out to the depth of the LED, and once I drilled the bulk of the plastic out, I then just gently let the drill spin to just finish clean it up inside and sort of polish it up a bit. But when you add the resin in, it has an interesting effect. It basically destroys the refractive index. It mates the plastic to the LED, and instead of getting the lens effect, you get the effect of just the bare LED chip being embedded into one solid piece of resin here. So it's quite a good effect. It makes it sort of very optically nice. So I'll put the wire strippers out of the way at the moment. I shall bring in this. I'm going to crop the leads. I'm not even going to note which is positive and which is negative here. And I'm going to sit it into a helping hand. This is where it would be really helpful if I focus down onto this. Let's zoom in a bit, and I'll focus onto this height. Is looking pretty good? That is looking pretty good. And then I'll be able to solder in the focus for better viewing. This is where I suddenly realised I should have looked out some solder. I haven't looked out solder. I have now. Doesn't take much solder. So I'm going to start by tinning the leads. Let's brighten this up a little bit as well. Oh, that's probably going to be too bright. Is that going to be too bright? It's not bad, actually. So I'm going to tin the leads by just heating them and flowing some solder onto them. Actually, I should have moistened the tip of the iron first. There we go. And cleaned it up. One of the things about what I did there with the melting the plastic with the tip of the iron, you have to be quite careful. It can damage the coating on the tip. It can sort of create a sort of cruddy layer on it. So it's not really normally recommended. But I did it. I'm going to also use a bit of heat shrink sleeving here, just to basically put a nice finish onto the end of the LEDs and hide these solder joints. So I'm cutting a couple of bits at just over 6mm, well, let's say 10. Let's actually say, well, they're more like a centimetre actually, which I was just thinking, what's that in inches? That would be roughly 3/8 of an inch is about the closest I could come to there. So I'm going to slip those over the ends, and I'm going to tin the wires as well. This is actually quite harshly bright, isn't it? Hold on. Can I do anything about that? Can I adjust that? No, I can't. I'm just making it worse. Okay, right, I'll just ignore that then. Actually, you know, it would have helped if I'd unlocked it when I was trying that. That would work better. That's going to... There we go. That's better. Just tame it down a little bit so it's not glary. So I'm going to tin this wire. And when you tin it, inevitably the plastic insulation will shrink up a little bit, so I'm going to crop it down a bit. I'm going to add a little bit of flux onto the wire. And then I'm going to flow that onto one of the LED pins. Line that up carefully and reflow that. That's looking pretty good. I usually say that and then it usually pops right off after I've just said it. So next I'm going to tin the next wire, the other end of the wire here, and put the sleeving over the end of it and then solder it on too. So tinning the wire, it is inevitably shrinking back a little bit. It's a slight downside that because I want the flexibility here, I've used this thinner wire, and it just means there's physically less to solder onto. Let's get some flux onto that. Put a dab in there as well. This just helps it mate together. This is a standard flux pen off eBay. Where's the other bit of sleeving? There's the other bit of sleeving. I shall slide that over now as well. and then mate these two together by reflowing the solder. Looks pretty good, a little wisp of smoke off the, well, vapour really, off the flux. And now I've done that, if there are any little solder peaks sticking up, I'm going to crop them off. And I'm going to slide the heat shrink sleeving down. And then heat shrink it. Where have I? No, there it is. It's running away down the end of the cable. So there's the heat shrink. So I'm going to slide it down onto the LED here. And then use the heat gun to just gently shrink that down. Now for the resistor that I'm putting in series to limit the current, and this is really a matter of choice, you know, it doesn't really matter too much. You can choose 100 ohms, you could choose 1k. I'm going to choose 100 ohms because in this case I want it to be fairly bright. But the first one of these I made, because I made one a while back, was for a wrap party for a BBC series called Intergalactic Kitchen. And because I've been doing the electronic effects, it seemed reasonable enough that I would go with just a glowing pendant with a piece of kryptonite in the end. And in that instance, I used a smaller battery pack, a rechargeable one, and also quite a high value resistor, so it just barely glowed. So it was this little bit of crystal hanging around the neck, but it was just that sort of just enough of a glow you're thinking, is that glowing itself? It was just a surrealistic glow, very nice. Subtlety is good with this situation. So I can put the resistor anywhere in line here, so I'll put it about halfway down. So I'll cut the wire here. And strip it. And this time, I may use a thicker piece of the heat shrink. I'm not actually sure if I should cover the whole resistor. It's one of those tricky decisions that I've got the resistor here, and I can either put a piece of heat shrink that covers the whole resistor but doesn't quite shrink onto the leads, or I can use two smaller pieces of heat shrink and have the resistor visible, but just cover the leads themselves and have it snug on quite nicely. I'm not sure. Lots of choices. Lots of indecision. So let's sit this in here, crop the lead down. The other thing I could do theoretically then is actually use a couple of short stubs of the heat shrink. Maybe about, well, I was going to say 6mm, I've done 10mm bits again. 10mm it is then. And I could also theoretically just slide another bit over both of them. So I'll cut a bit of this about 20mm, which is about 3/4 of an inch. And once again, I'll tin the wires. You could theoretically hold these together and flow solder on for the best joint, but to be honest, it's a lot easier if you just tin the resistor lead and tin the wire and then reflow them together. It just makes it easier in the long run. In this case, I won't trim that too much. I shall slide this big bit of sleeving over, and then this smaller bit of sleeving, and then I shall solder that on, and I'll just put a dab of flux on again, because the flux just basically, it cleans surfaces. That's the purpose of it. When you flow the solder, it just cleans the surfaces and lets them mate together better. And now this is quite fine. I'm going to just reflow those together. Let them cool, and that should be it. Okay. So now let's do the other resistor side. So let's crop this to about 1/8 of an inch, 3mm. Put it into the grips. Someone suggested putting heat shrink sleeving at the end of the grips. That was quite a good suggestion. I'm pretty sure I've come across that before, but it was a good being reminded of it, because it's something I've just never really done. And it is a good idea. It means it's less likely components will just spring out the grips. So let's flow some solder on here and onto the resistor. I'll crop this down slightly. Add the heat shrink sleeving. Then a little touch of flux. And join them together. Oops. So let's line these up and reflow. Excellent. So that's the resistor now in line. So let's get the heat shrink down. So what I'm going to do is I've got the smaller piece of heat shrink that I'll just slide over the leads. I'm going to crop, I've got a little tiny peak in the solder here. So I'll just nip that off and then pop the sleeving down. There is another sleeve the other side which is once again trying to escape up the end of the wire. There we go. And I shall heat shrink that round. I do like this little heat gun. It comes as part of the soldering station. This is a Yahoo 8786D. I've had it for a while. It took a while to really take a shine to it, but then once, I think this heat gun is the main thing that really made me appreciate it. They're not perfect, the little cheapy Chinese soldering stations, but you get used to them and they're actually quite acceptable. So let's now put this bigger sleeve over, and that will cover the resistor and it will go onto those other bits of thinner heat shrink sleeving. So that is now everything concealed out of sight and securely supported. Right, so now I pull this straight, and at the other end I'm going to chop this for the battery. So I'm just going to crop it here. And I've not quite decided what I'm going to do with the battery yet, so I'm going to actually strip a modest length of the wire. And twist. This is proper copper cable, it's not copper coated aluminium, so it's twisting nicely. This is where if you try to twist the wires together and they're just springing straight back, you've probably got the copper coated aluminium. It's a horrible stuff. It's like a disaster in the making. I can't help feeling that part of the reason that we're getting copper coated aluminium cable, which is just a complete fire hazard, is because the speculators have been investing in copper and it's driven the price of copper up. I don't think there's a shortage of copper, I just think it's had its price driven up by people who are just cashing in on everything basically. And we're all going to have to pay the price in building fires because the copper coated aluminium just is not a great idea. It may be cheaper than copper, but it's not electrically what I'd call great. America learned the hard way about aluminium house wiring as not being particularly a good idea because of the oxidizing on the surface that results in bad connections. So that's this done. So let's put this across the battery and just see how it's looking so far. I don't know where the polarity is, so I'm just going to try it both ways round. Let's get another button cell. So is it going to flash when I put it in this way round? No, it's not. So put it the other way round and there it goes. It's flickering nicely. Okay, so I'm going to actually mark with a wee tiny stripe of Sharpie. I'm going to mark this red, just a reminder. Just a wee stripe on one side. Excellent. Right, now I'm going to resin the LED into the crystal. So for this, I'm going to bring in a little plastic shot glass. I'm going to bring in the 2-part resin. I'm going to squirt in an equal quantity of each into the bottom of the thing. I don't need an awful lot, but I'm going to put in more than I need because that just makes it easier to get a consistent quantity. It also makes it easier to mix. And I'm going to use a wooden stirrer just to mix that 2-part resin up. This resin typically has a curing time of about 5 minutes. So obviously I'm not going to let the video run while this is curing because that would just get tedious. So a good thorough mixing to make sure it is thoroughly blended together because that's the best results. And then I'm going to get a bit of white tack actually, and I'm going to ram the crystal into that just to keep it upright while the resin's curing. And I'm going to scoop some resin in. This is where you have to be quite careful dripping the resin in. Ideally, you just put a little single drip and the resin will gradually flow and then it will drip, but it's quite gooey. And if it's wanting to drip too large a bit, sometimes you're better just actually using a wire to scrape it off, or better still, get it into the bottom of that crystal and smear it about a bit, because the more you can mate it onto the surfaces in there, the more transparent it will be to the light. So you want to actually basically coat the inside with the resin to make sure there's no air bubbles trapped. So let's scoop some more resin out and get some more in there. And this is a delicate balance. You want enough to completely engulf the LED when you put it in, but you don't want so much that when you put the LED in, it squirts out everywhere in all directions. It may require some trial and error. I think this is going to work, so let's lower the LED into it. Yes, it is squishing up around the LED. That's about right. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to actually put some of the resin onto the top of the LED as well, and around the connections. I'm just going to smear it around them to provide a little bit of extra support. In fact, I might add a tiny bit more resin on top of that. I think that's sat down completely. Yes, it is. Resin has this really annoying habit of flowing very easily. You'll find this when you start using it, that if it can escape anywhere, it will escape. That's looking pretty good though. Right, so while that's curing, I then have to consider what I'm going to use for the battery. The battery could be literally as simple. If you're not going to use this an awful lot, you could bunch the wire up and solder it, and this is what I'll probably do then. And you could literally wrap tape around the battery just to hold the wires on for that night that you're going to use it. The main thing is, I would recommend that you avoid having, if you're going to be wearing this over the back of your neck when you have the pendant on, so I'd recommend avoiding letting both connections touch your neck, because it can cause irritation. But the slight current flow, the DC current flow through your neck, can actually cause a slight sort of redness just because it damages the cells. It's not as bad as it sounds. Well, it is in some instances, but it just, it's good to keep all metals away from the skin, particularly if there's a little current flow involved. So I'm going to pause the video momentarily while I let this set. Time has passed, the glue has set, we're ready to add the battery pack. And while the glue was setting, I raked around amongst my stuff, and I found an actual little battery holder that's perfect. So let's pull these wires straight, let's crop them down a bit and put them onto that. This is where I wish I'd actually known I had this little holder. I would have kept some of that resin. The resin's all cured now, but I could just make some more up. But I would have actually not just put the wire on, but then I'd have bridged it to actually make it stronger and insulate it with the resin. But I've done what I've done. So I've forgotten the polarity of these. That's all right though. Let's tin the holders down here. So I'm just going to focus right back down onto the table again, and I'm going to tin these connections. It's a surface mount battery holder. I got these for another application. I didn't like them. I didn't use them in it. The reason for that was because you didn't have access to this connection here. It wasn't sticking out the end. It was like it relied on, if you had it in a surface mount application, it required the whole thing to be heated up. And the particular application I had, that couldn't be done. So it wasn't an ideal solution. Let's remind myself of the polarity of this by just dabbing it on either side of a lithium cell and seeing which side makes it light up. I could put the soldering iron down for this. That looks like I've got a trace of red on that. Yes, that's it. So this is the positive, which will be connecting to the back connection here. So I'll solder that on there. The other thing I could have done is add a bit of heat shrink to that. I could have actually done that. Well, I haven't. But I could do it afterwards. Let's make sure these aren't tangled and connect the other lead onto there. And in this case, either way, I'd recommend just putting a bit of tape over this if you had this dangling down your neck somewhere, just as a precaution. So that's it soldered on. That's ready just to take the battery. The battery clips in like this. And the crystal is now glowing. So if I turn the light off now, the Kryptonite, let's take the exposure off and you'll see the effect. It is just, well, I was going to say gently glowing, it's more than gently glowing, it is quite ferocious. But that's the effect that's desired. Basically a pendant with this hang round your neck and just gently undulating and shimmering away to itself, or just a gentle glow. So that looks like a good result to me. It's a very simple project, but it looks really good in actual use. So just for reference, in a brightly lit room with a 40-watt LED lamp above me, the Kryptonite chunk hanging around my neck is actually quite bright. That's with the 100 ohm resistor. So while this might be alright for a sort of convention centre for cosplay or something like that, if you wanted to take it into a darker environment like say a nightclub or something like that, then you'd probably want to go for a much higher value resistor like 470 ohm or 1000 ohms just to tame it down a bit, because it's actually quite ferocious. Well, not unless you like the attention, obviously. And the other bonus here is that this is going to keep that pesky Superman at bay while you're committing villainous deeds.